So we're going to talk about the front rack today. Front rack is just the position that we get into when we're doing a lot of things. We'll talk about that here in a second. A little bit about me. My name's Curtis. Nice to meet you all again, yes. I've been doing physical therapy since 2007, so for quite a while. And during that journey, I've focused a lot on this idea of functional movement, functional mobility. And in this setting, in the CrossFit setting, that really comes through pretty powerfully. There's a lot that we can help in the CrossFit world when we start talking about functional mobility. There are a couple of tools that I use when I'm assessing a person and looking at if they're moving well, if they're not moving well. And today we're going to use a couple of those concepts to look at how you're moving and how that equates to the front rack. I also incorporated functional medicine in 2019, that's last year, at the end of 2019. And so if anybody has questions about that, we're not talking about that specifically today, but I love to talk about that, so feel free to grab me at any time if you have questions on that. So Andrew, if everybody got the email, sent out an email and saying that he, as the owner here, and then the coaches, and me included in that, the goal is that we're trying to give you guys more stuff, more to understand why we're working out the way that we're working out. From my end, how to work out better, how to work out safer. My personal goal is that this local community of Infernal members, plus as many other CrossFit type people and gyms as we can find, my personal goal is to make us all safe. I want for people to look at CrossFit and say, yes, I love doing that, I feel safe doing that, I can do it. You know, there's a lot of benefit to these functional movements that we do in CrossFit, and it's my job, my role, my goal to make sure that we're all safe when we do them. And when we're safe and we can move better, then that makes it that much more fun. You can push yourself that much harder. You can get that much better improvements in the things that you're looking for. So that's my personal thought process on this. So to get to that point, we need to talk about what mobility is. And it makes sense. It's how you move, right? It's ease of movement, freedom of movement, the ability for your body to move or for something to move your body, right? And we do a little bit of both of those when we're lifting a bar. We have to move around this bar that's heavy and weighted. We also have to move ourselves so that we can make an effect on that bar. The opposite of that would be if we can't move, right? If we're too stiff, if we're too tight, if we're restricted, if a muscle is too weak, or if a joint can't move, then that's going to get in the way of how easily we can move the things that we're trying to move ourselves, and eventually that's going to turn into some issues with how we can perform. If we have, for example, yesterday we were doing a lot of cleans, right? So if we can't get into those motions, if it's difficult to get into a place where you can hold the bar with ease and with efficiency, that's going to affect how hard you can push yourself. It's going to affect how heavy of a load you can move. In the long term, it could affect how safe you are, right? If you have to cheat somewhere, you have to sacrifice your hips or sacrifice your back or sacrifice your wrists to move into these positions, because that's the only way that you can accomplish the movement, then if that's a poor compensation, you're likely to hurt yourself, or at least it's more risky. And again, since it's my goal and my job in life to make sure that we're not hurting ourselves so that we can do everything we want to do, we got to figure out how we can move. I talked about it earlier. I use the functional movement screen as kind of a way to just from sort of a bird's eye perspective look at how people are moving. We're not going to go through a full functional movement screen today. However, it's a thing that we'll talk about much more in the future. But we can use a couple of those concepts and kind of zone in on a few particular points that we care about as far as the front rack is concerned. So when I talk about what normal movement is, all of my normals are based on what the functional movement screen, what that system has put together. The functional movement screen has been around for a long, long time. Their system has been very, very well researched. They have a ton of articles and stuff on what normal is. So if you looked at some other resources, you might see different numbers if we were talking about angles and ranges of motion and things like that. But just so that we're all on the same page, when we're talking about normal, my normals are based on what this functional movement system approach says, right? The other part of that is how much do we need, right? Do you need to be ballerina flexible? Do you need to be, Olympic gymnast flexible? Maybe not for just moving around and living life. But we do need to be mobile enough, right? So if we're going to pick up a heavy bar, or if we're going to do a pull-up, or if we're going to do something that could put our shoulders or back or neck or hips or legs or whatever at risk, then we need to make sure that we're mobile enough. And so that's kind of the goal for today, is to figure out, are you mobile at all? And are you mobile enough to do some of these movements? And then obviously, if you're not, what can we do to improve that and change that? So again, a little bit more about the FMS. I won't go through too much about this, but they have a great website, lots of available articles. You don't have to be a member or anything. You can look at all their research and look at their system. It's a really cool system. Like I said, I've been using it since about 2010, I think. So for quite a while. And it's just been growing and getting better and more refined as I've been going along. One point I wanted to point out right here. The reason that I use this is because it explains the role of mobility, motor control, and functional patterns in very fundamental movements. And that, corresponds well with the CrossFit thought process of functional movements, the most effective and efficient movements you can use to gain strength and power and speed and agility and all these things. If you go to the CrossFit website, Greg Glassman has written out these 10 core values of movement, and the functional movement system really, really corresponds well with those. So if we did a functional movement screen, and we want to talk about why we want to be somewhere in here, right, between a 3 and a 2. So there's a couple of different movements that you do. You look at some patterns, and you see, can you perform a movement perfectly, right? If you can't perform it perfectly, can you cheat just a little bit and get really, really close to perfect? And those are basically where we want to be in life and in sports. If you can't do it 100% perfectly, can you figure out a way to get to it close enough that you're not putting yourself at risk for injury? It kind of goes back to, are you moving enough versus what's necessary, right? So necessary is just the smallest of cheat to get the thing accomplished safely, right? Less than that is that you can't perform the movement safely at all. And again, we'll kind of show you guys some movements as we're getting through this that look at what those cheats can be that are effective, and then if it's just not working out well for you at all. Obviously, if something is painful, we want to avoid that movement, and we can talk about that as well. Since I'm a physical therapist, if you're painful, right, go see somebody. Don't see anybody to get you out of pain. The point is, you don't want to move into pain because pain creates a bad pattern. Bad patterns wreck this whole thought process of us moving effectively and efficiently. And so, again, my personal goal is that we are all safe movers and that we are all efficient movers so that we can get the best out of this environment of exercise that we can, right? Instead of cheating ourselves or, making something else hurt to avoid hurting something in the first place. And then this describes what the scoring is. If there's 7 movements and the best score is 3, obviously it's 21. There's a cutoff here that they've done a lot of research on. We said that we want to get, if we can get a cheat and then everything looks really good and it's a simple cheat, then that's good enough as well, right? And so if you get a 2 across all 7 of these movements, then that's a 14. Less than a 14 means that you can't make a movement, or it's painful, or there's a difference between one side or the other. So these two components here, a score less than 14 or something that's different on your right leg or arm or right direction versus left direction. Asymmetries are really, really dangerous as well, because that means that something is moving, something is not moving on the other side, which means that you're more likely to hurt one of the two of those. Either you're using something too much and it's gotten really good, but it's not, or it's doing it more than its fair share, or the other side is not mobile enough, not strong enough, not safe enough, right? So again, just a little bit about the movement screen and how that works. Now, less about fancy PT things, and let's get back into the front rack. So we use the front rack for not everything, but almost everything. Front squats, anything that comes out of a front squat, a thruster, any of the press movements start in a front rack, a push press, a push jerk. Obviously, we get into a clean and jerk, that gets into the front rack. Anything that we do with a bar that's not lifting it in a deadlift position generally has the front rack position. And talking with Andrew, figuring out what kinds of things we wanted to deliver to you guys, front rack was top on his list. I think because it's used in so many different movements. Looked up, I think I found this on CrossFit.com, what the appropriate front rack position is, and that's elbows pointed forward. And I've got some pictures here in a second. Arms externally rotated, that's a PT term. I'll show you what that looks like. A loose grip, and then the bar is resting on the front deltoid, or the front part of the muscle on your shoulder. And here are a couple of pictures of a good front rack position, right? So we can see the guy here on the top, elbows are pointed straight forward, right? That bar is resting, if you can see right there on the front meaty part of his shoulder, across his collarbone, but not on his neck. His body is upright. Man, he's in a really deep squat. I'm kind of jealous of this guy. Everything is upright. Same thing over here. Lady's got arms maybe a little bit down here on the right side compared to the left side. This guy's got definitely a really loose grip. Her grip is a little bit less loose, but still elbows pointed straight forward. Bar resting right there on the top front part of the shoulder. So those are good front rack positions, right? On the other hand, we've got a couple of bad front rack positions. So again, guy up here on the top left, I've seen some folks in here that look like that. I'm not going to name any names. I don't think any of them are here right now.
Hey, I've worked for 5 years to get to that point.
I'm proud of you.
That's
Proud of you, Andrew. But yeah, so this guy, I mean, and why is this a bad position, right? Why is it ineffective or inefficient? If he wanted to do thrusters, the entire time that he is working his way down into the squat and then back up into the standing position and then trying to push that bar up overhead, he's holding that however heavy that bar is. So all of that energy that's in his shoulders that he's using to hold that bar up, he doesn't get any rest time in his arms, right? Which means that he's under tension, he's going to be using more energy, his heart's going to be beating harder, he's going to be using more oxygen, and that creates inefficiency. Even if that's a light weight, if that rests on his chest, his arms can kind of turn off, right? You can just sort of guide the bar by resting it on your arms. And the other part of that is if you're trying to get that bar overhead and it's heavy, there's a lot of leg movement that creates upward momentum on the bar, right? And it's much more difficult to transmit that momentum through his body, through his shoulders, through his elbow, through his hand, up through his wrist, through his fingers to get that bar to lift up. He's gonna lose a lot of that momentum and energy from the hip movement to throw that bar overhead because nothing is connected, right? Guy in the bottom left, we talked about shoulders externally rotated. That position, arms crossed, creates an internal rotation. Now, if all he was doing was a front squat, we could probably be okay with that, right? The legs can still work. It's still resting on his shoulders. Obviously, that can't be used for any of the dynamic movements like a thruster or a push press or a push clean or a clean and jerk, right? The other part of that is when your arms are internally rotated, we won't get too much in the anatomy and physiology of it, but it's really easy for the shoulders and the upper back to round forward, right? And again, that starts creating some bad patterns, potentially some bad compensations when you're not locked into a nice tall position through your spine. And then this is a really good example of why we want the bar resting on the front part of the shoulders, is because if we can get in a good position with the bar on the front part of the shoulders and other things are mobile enough, then that bar is basically right in your center of mass, right? It's not leaning forward, obviously it's not pulled back. And so when you're doing a squat, trying to come back up, or if you're doing anything that's more dynamic and powerful, you want that bar directly over the feet so that when you push through your feet, all of that energy is transmitted up. You're not wasting any energy by keeping it from falling forward or keeping it from falling backwards. You can give 100% of that energy for a straight up kind of a movement. And in this sort of a position, it would be difficult, again, because it's disconnected now, it's not in that same line of gravity, it's difficult to get that pressure and that force to go straight up and then also have the bar move straight up, right? It's going to create kind of a more forward motion. Hips maybe come up first, you lose some of that power, you have to try to get it back, and then it messes up with efficiency. Fair enough? All right. So we just talked about these, some failure points, reasons that you might have difficulty getting into this front rack position. Obviously, if your shoulders are really tight, you have a hard time rotating your arm up underneath the bar or rotating your arms out so that you can hold on to the bar. If your wrists are not flexible enough, if you can't get your hands to hold on to the bar in that front position, then it would make it difficult. Even if your shoulders are mobile enough, if the wrist can't get there, then it's kind of hard to get your arm tucked up underneath. If the back, I would say if it's either too stiff, if it can't extend back, or if it's too weak, you can't control that position. Either of those can mess up with the front rack. And again, that puts a whole lot of difficulty into this power production where we're trying to get the bar to move with our legs, even though we're holding it with our hands, right? Because that force gets put other places into trying to control the bar or trying to control your posture. Less obvious points, kind of similar to the first ones, but if your shoulders are just kind of hunched forward, it's really hard to get your hands back far enough or to get the bar in a good spot because you're already in that kind of forward-leaning position. So this is more of like a just general posture kind of a thing. If the shoulders are in front of your center of mass in the first place, and then you put that bar there, right, then it's really, really hard to get that back without creating some weird compensations. Similarly, if your ankles are tight or if your hips are tight, that's going to have an effect on where your pelvis has to be, which is going to affect where your spine has to be, right? So if the ankles cave in, if it makes the knees kind of collapse, if that makes the hips do something weird, then your spine and your pelvis can't really get under the bar the way that they need to, right? So it's not simply shoulder mobility that's an issue here, or wrist mobility, or elbow mobility. It kind of covers everything. We'll go through, so that we're not loading you down with every single piece of anatomy and physiology, we'll go through some shoulder and upper back mobility stuff. But you can't rule out ankles and hips as issues that might create some difficulties in your front rack. So, why do we need to be more mobile, right? Why do we need flexibility? We talked about it at the beginning. We're trying to create a better pattern so that you can move well. If you get really good at moving with a bad pattern, then you're really good at moving with a bad pattern. Does that make sense? We want to be good at moving with good patterns. I'd even say it's probably better to struggle at being good with a good pattern than to be really, really good at a bad pattern, right? Because at that point, at least you're safe and you're struggling, right? Compared to, for sure, working in a potentially unsafe posture and unsafe motion, right? The other part of it is, we're trying to get the best out of this. We're trying to work as hard as we can, push as hard as we can, work as fast as we can, or lift as heavy as we can, depending on the workout. And if we've got something in the way of that, then we're kind of selling ourselves short, right? If you could lift heavier, except you can't hold it up with your wrists, and you can't hold it up with your wrists because you can't rest it on your shoulders, and you can't get it on your shoulders because your spine is too tight, then you're missing out on some of the effects of the training, right? Or you're going to see slower gains, slower improvements from what you're trying to do, right? And then the last part, again, my personal goal here is that I don't want anybody to get injured. I hate it when a person says, oh, I can't do that because I've hurt my back, or gosh, I'm going to avoid this lift, or I'm going to change this lift because I don't want to hurt something, which means probably they've already hurt themselves doing it, right? And that fear kind of cuts short what we're doing here, right? We want to move well, we want to move often, we want to move powerfully, we want to get fit, we want to get strong. And if we're afraid to move because we've injured, or if we're at risk for injuring because we don't know how to move, then it kind of sells the whole thing short. So, how can you fix it? We're going to go over that here in a little bit. First part is to understand where or if you have a limitation somewhere, right? We're going to talk about some very simple ways to look at how you move, coaches, some ways that you can see how the members are moving, how your own movements are. But we need to be consistent at looking at those things, right? Once we figure out what's moving poorly, then we want to focus on our form when we're moving in those patterns that we're poor at, until we get good at them, right? So if you know that your shoulders are stiff, or if you know that your spine is stiff, and you know that that workout is going to challenge you, it's better to be safer than it is to injure yourself, right? So focus on a lighter lift or a more controllable lift for now, so that you don't hurt yourself, because it's way easier to fix something that's not broken, that sounds weird, than it is to try to go through a full rehab process after you've damaged the tissue, right? And again, be consistent on that. If you're like, oh, I'm feeling good one day, and then that's the day that you decide to go heavy, and that's the day that you strain your back, that wasn't a good idea. My personal preference, and a lot of the research bears this out, if you're going to work on mobility, it needs to be before you do a thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we're doing what we're doing. And again, we want to be consistent with that. One time working on your shoulder mobility or your spine mobility isn't going to fix anything, right? It might make things a little bit looser for that second, but then what are you going to do with that second, right? What are you going to do after the workout when you work on your mobility? You're going to go sit in your car, you're going to drive home, you're going to sit and have dinner and watch TV, right? And that doesn't do anything for improving your mobility, right? And then lastly, where I come in as a physical therapist, if you can't fix it, if you have tried, if you're doing something and it's not making a result, come talk to me. Say, hey, Curtis, I'm trying this. You know, I've been doing this stretch that you talked about, or I've been doing this stretch that I saw on the internet or that somebody told me to do. It's not working. I'm not feeling more flexible. I'm still struggling. Pull me aside, say, you know, give me some advice. What can I do? How can I help you? Because that's what my role here at this gym is to give that advice and give that help. Again, so that we can be safe, so that we can be efficient and effective, so that we can get the best, we can get the best out of what we're doing here at the gym.